Greetings, viewers. I'm going to do something a little different with this podcast. Normally, I do short summaries of my writing projects after I've completed them and talk about what I hope to achieve and what I did achieve and some of the main themes of the article or the book project. This case, I'm doing something different, and that's due to the scale and scope of the challenge of writing it. So, sort of borrowing a page from video game culture and sort of opening up the writing process to you all, the viewers. So if any of you in the audience are interested in these things, you have tips, you have history texts you want to let me know about, some of the stuff strikes a spark with you, let me know. I'll put my contact information in the information below the video. So the basic story is I'm working on the next project of my next iteration of my history project, and this is the period between 1914 and 1945. So this is the beginning of the end. 2 world wars, multiple revolutions, civil wars. It's the beginning of the end of the colonial empires that have run the world system since 1492, and the end of the beginning of certain forms of anti-colonial and anti-imperial resistances and mobilizations that also have been occurring since 1492 in different ways and shapes and forms all across the planet. Now, the biggest problem that I'm wrestling with right now in the writing, of course, is this basic problem of all of our histories are, for the most part, histories of national empires. And there's a sort of blurry line between what is national and what is imperial, but it's really national imperial histories. These are most of what is in the record, most of what's been produced. So we have very good, thorough histories of certain structural logic of the French Empire. We have certain good histories of the British Empire, of the German Empire, the American Empire, the Romanov Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Qing Empire. But what we lack 2 things. Number one, the interconnections between these 2 things. And part of that is we just didn't have the tools to understand them or to access them. There had to be a sort of a critical mass of translators and interdisciplinary work and archives explored. And we had to actually build the national imperial histories out enough to the point where they kind of began to ran into each other. And then someone showed up and said, oh, there's this problem of border. What is this? Is this British or is this French or is it both? And then that unlocked certain other kinds of logics. So this is one part of the story. But the other part of the story is that which is not empire. These are the histories of the resistances, insurgencies, and rebellions against empire. So what we call democracy. And the deepest level of democracy, that free human beings making decisions to make their lives better and making the best informed decision they have, working with other human beings in some kind of organized political structure. So this deep democratization that's also been happening since 1492, which is a very uneven, very violent process, violent contestation between empires and polities which are a little bit more informed by democracy than some others. And it's this messy battle of gray versus gray. Some of the polities are very authoritarian, but they're a little more democratic and therefore a little more productive and open to change and innovation, and more autocratic empires, less so, and so on and so forth. So how do we think about these things? How do we create I almost want to say a deep history of democracy since 1492? We have all these imperial histories, and yet the fact remains the empires are gone, and they're not coming back. They're not coming back. We're not going back to empire any more than we're going back to the age of the steamship. No, it's not going to happen. That's not on the cards. So what do we do with this empire problem? Well, I think the first task is to start to liberate our sense of history from empire. We can't let empire rule or dominate our notion of history anymore. We have to critique that notion as itself a kind of an ideology, a way of thinking about the past, of structuring it to fit the imperial system or the imperial systems or different ones of them. We have to stop that and ask, well, if that's true, what are those ways that were not imperial? What were the counter-imperial? What were the proto-democratic, quasi-democratic, or just outright, plebeian democratic forms of contestation, argumentation, innovation, meditation, what have you? Okay, there'll be a wide range of these things. It's not going to be one simple story. So this is already incredibly ambitious. Yes, and of course, the sheer impossibility of the project is what makes it so fascinating, because you can achieve nothing worthwhile unless it's at the very least impossible, and then maybe something will come of it because you're pushing past what you thought was possible, critiquing that. So, okay. So on the one hand, imperial histories, and on the other hand, histories of the anti-colonial, anti-imperial forms of democracy, essentially. So I have two solutions for this, and I want to flag these ahead of time. I've been working on, by the way, I've been working on the text, and I have approximately 4 chapters written. It'll be 9 or 10 or maybe 11 chapters, so I'm not more than maybe 1/4 of my way through the full text. But again, I want to flag this ahead of time as a way of opening up the writing process to you all, and the thinking of history to you all. Some of you may have faced the same problem in your own, when writing your own texts. 2 strategies I focused on. There's a narrative strategy, and then there's a geopolitical strategy for framing the argument. The narrative strategy is that I'm plundering a great deal from the great writers of the period 1914-1945. And this is a classic period of the international modernisms, to use a qualified term that comparative literature has come up with. These are modernisms, forms of art that are profoundly industrial, but still have a sort of a pre-industrial, pre-capitalist, semi-feudal aspect to them, but that's in contact with these very advanced industrial forms, and they clash, and they generate all this energy and sparks and chaos and mayhem every which way. But it's a very interesting and dynamic moment, and it creates all this wonderful forms of culture, art, film culture, music innovation, and on and on and on. Jazz music, atonal music, abstraction and painting, great films of Chaplin and Keaton, on and on and on. Fritz Lang. There's a raft. Okay, we go on and on and on about this. Okay, so the narrative strategy, there are a whole range of international modernisms, but the one I kind of cottoned onto very much by accident, and those of you who are literature historians will have a good laugh at this. Actually, I owe a great deal of debt of thanks to James Joyce, because what I'm basically doing is stealing from Ulysses. Ulysses, wonderful text and one of the great novels of world history, but famous and scandalous because every chapter has a different style. And of course, famous commentary by Ezra Pound didn't think highly of this strategy. He had his own reasons for thinking about aesthetics, which were conservative and reactionary. Great poet, but deeply reactionary. Joyce, of course, was not going to be dissuaded from this, and he had a specific reason for this. As an Irish writer in exile in France and Paris, he has his way of dealing with this complexity of being in a place but not being in a place, so he creates a new style, a new style, a new style. And that's what I'm doing in this work. Each chapter is meant to be a springboard for the next. So just to give you a little example of what this means, I have a chapter in my text covering World War I. So the military strategy, the economics, the culture, the political mobilizations, basically explaining why the Entente had to win and the Central Powers had to lose. And this was baked in from the beginning, the moment that the war starts. There's no way that the Central Powers ever, in any conceivable scenario, get to win that war. It's not possible for some deep structural reasons. Okay, that's that chapter. The next chapter looks at the consequences of this victory. The Entente didn't plan on this, but because they won the war, they shattered 4 of the biggest land empires, the Austrian, Ottoman, German, and Romanov empires. And they all devolve into civil war and have horribly violent shakeout of systems, and a whole bunch of new polities shows up on the rubble of these former empires. Some places it's more violent, some less, but it's a great deal of chaos. So the next chapter looks at that, and it talks about the cycle of uprisings that takes place from approximately 1916. Some would date it from 1915, some 1917. I used 1916 as sort of a more or less general marker, all the way to 1922, looking at just at those uprisings. They're fascinating, they're complex. It's not just a story about the Bolsheviks, they're just one of many of the uprisings that takes place in this time. The other uprising, which doesn't even take place in the European theater or Asian theater, but is just as important and just as interesting and influential, of course, is the Mexican Revolution that's happening. So I have a section, I have an passage that covers that and how that's relevant to the story and how all these processes are happening sort of together. And these uprisings, they're aware of each other and they learn from each other, and they're sort of like characters in a crowd. They're almost like a crowd of people that Joyce talks about, where something happens and then something happens and then something happens. It's this chain of communication and strategy, and then a riot breaks out or something. Yeah, it's exactly that. I am heavily channeling the Anglo-American fiction world for some of the formal solutions to be able to even state these things as history. Okay, now, so that's the form strategy, the provisional form strategy I have. Each chapter is sort of a springboard for the next, forming a sort of a set of links. Okay, and of course the danger there is that I'll miss a link and the thing will sort of fall apart like a chain with a weak link. So there can't be a single weak link. It all has to reinforce each other, and then the chain will hold. So that's the aesthetic challenge, which is also a history challenge and an intellectual challenge. So the second part, there's the form, then there's the content. And the content, I don't have time to delve too deep here, but I'll limit myself for this podcast to talking just about the post-1922 period, where there's a whole series of reactions against those insurrections. The 1916, 1922 uprisings, rebellions, revolutions, some of which take state power, some of which are crushed. There's a reaction to those. And that reaction, of course, is European and Japanese fascism. But it's not just those fascisms. It's a range of other polities all across the planet. Polities as diverse. Mexico has a revanchist because of the rule of the PRI after the revolution. Brazil, the corporatist system, Estado Novo, under Vargas, takes power, ends democracy for a number of years in Brazil. On and on and on and on and on, all across the planet. So this is a general tendency of the 1920s, 1930s. And there's a world systems story here, which I don't think anyone in the world systems community has flagged this, but they really should start to think about this seriously. And then there's something fascinating about this revanchism. All of these revanchisms are rooted in the 8 semi-peripheral empires of 1914. None of them take power in the 5 core polities. All of them take place in the 8 semi-peripheral empires. That's fascinating. That cannot be an accident. We have to count down those empires, the 8 empires. Austria, they lose their empire and then they go fascist. Italy, fascism with Mussolini. Japan goes fascist. Germany goes fascist. The Ottoman Empire, authoritarian system under Ataturk, Mustafa Kemal's independent Turkey. Portugal, Salazar. Russia turns into Stalinism. And Spain, Franco's fascism. So all of the 8, every single one of these 8 moves away from democracy and towards despotism, and is to a significant degree, even when there's allegedly a progressive left-wing government running, Bolshevik Russia, but it turns into this horrendous despotism. And that too needs to be explained. In fact, I'm going to have a whole chapter on Stalinism in this text. Anyway, getting back to the point, all 8 move towards increasing authoritarianism. And not just the 8 semi-peripheral empires, many polities of the semi-periphery, particularly in Central and South America, move towards greater despotism after 1922. The only places which really resist this are the core polities. So the United States, Britain, France, Netherlands, Belgium. And of course, they're colonial empires, and of course they're despotisms, and within their imperial possessions, they're completely despotic systems. But within the core, there are some democratic institutions which function and they're not destroyed. There are revanchist movements that attempt to destroy those democratic institutions. They fail. So this is a story that needs much greater attention. Why? Why did this happen? Why was the Stalinist system completely wrong? Its ideologists would go on and on about how, the most advanced, the capitalist empires were the most autocratic in fascism, and therefore we have to ally with the German Nazis to fight against Britain because it's a fake democracy or some nonsense. And that turned out to be an absolutely catastrophic mistake that cost the lives of tens of millions of people. But it's also a theoretical and intellectual mistake. It's a fundamental misreading of the problem. It's not understanding that why didn't these revanchisms take over the core? That's a problem that I attempt to address, and that's actually forms one of the chapters where I'm asking the question, how is it that there was resistance to this revanchism in those spaces and places? I don't have time to go into details, but a couple of the interesting, I'll just flag a couple things. The 5 core polities are where the most powerful forms of a new international commons starts to emerge. And by international commons, I mean forms of solidarity between the anti-colonial and anti-imperial and pro-democracy movements of the entire planet. So the flip side of these imperial structures is that the core is the only place where you're somewhat freer and can organize and mobilize and do certain forms of solidarity work at certain times in history. That's changed a lot nowadays because our planet is very different. But back in the day, those spaces were very, very important. And if you study any of the great leaders, I mean, the classic example is the way that, Gandhi uses the spaces of the British Empire to kind of shift from South Africa to India. But he also has a very keen sense of British culture, its decorum, its propriety, how it thinks of itself. And he uses this as a tool to do certain things. You can critique Gandhiism and its movement, but politically this was effective. So it's the story of this international commons that we need to unpack and think about, because it's a very different beast from the international commons of the late 19th century. The high water mark of the Paris Commune and certain forms of trade union mobilization and the first labor parties and other social democratic parties. It's a very different beast. And the 1914, 1945s, and the beginnings of a whole raft of new movements, new resistances, all which began to talk to each other. They didn't necessarily coordinate well with each other, but there was a basic sense of that we're all in this together, and that created fascinating and interesting and important innovations, politically and culturally and from an economic perspective. So I'll stop here. This has gone on far too long. The next, I'm going to do a number of these. I'm going to do at least 2 more, focusing on some of the other issues in the early part of this text. But I'm going to basically, with these podcasts, I'm going to lay out what I hope to do. And then once the text is done, you can judge for yourselves that I fail or succeed in fulfilling whatever goals there were. So let me stop here.